We get ever closer to the dream of loot boxes being banned entirely as Brazil joins a handful of other countries in the fight against loot boxes and opens the process to ban loot boxes altogether. Let's get into it. Brazilian authorities have launched an inquiry aimed at banning loot boxes in the country on the recommendation of the National Association of Child and Adolescent Defense Centers, or ANCED, or ANCED. The association argued that randomized monetization mechanics are a form of gambling, which is illegal in Brazil, the Esports Observer reported. And this is all followed by an in-depth study by the University of Plymouth and the University of Wolverhampton, who concluded that loot boxes are structurally and psychologically akin to gambling. And I have to say that these universities did a very good job, as I can see in this 50-page study detailing everything. They touch on everything from the gaming industry's self-regulation or lack thereof, and the origins of loot boxes and its evolution from mobile gaming. And as you can see here, it also has various stats as to who exactly is purchasing loot boxes, or the demographics of people who are purchasing loot boxes. Keep in mind that these particular stats are from the UK only. So one thing you'll notice immediately upon looking at these percentages here, or these stats, or these demographics of people who are opening loot boxes, is that it ranges from 18-year-olds all the way up to 65-year-olds, but it doesn't show the fact that children are opening loot boxes as well, wreaking or causing devastating effects, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But I want to read to you what it says here. While our data does not extend to children, we know that many consumers of loot boxes are children, with studies estimating that around 25 to 50% of children and adolescents have opened loot boxes. And again, this study concluded that loot boxes are psychologically akin to gambling. And it goes without saying, in terms of children, the fear is that it'll lead to long-term psychological effects like gambling addiction, or it may cause other forms of addiction in the future for these children. A study by the Gambling Health Alliance suggested that young people struggle to keep track of how much they have spent on loot boxes. 23% of 11 to 16-year-olds said they had paid money to open loot boxes, with 34% of all respondents saying they had first purchased them by the time they were 13 years of age. And this is due to the lack of age restriction on games containing the randomized monetization mechanic. And as you all know, the ESRB, or the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, is in bed with a lot of these gaming companies, making it so that a lot of these gaming companies can put loot boxes in a bunch of their games, and the ESRB still rates those games E for everyone, or there's just nothing mentioning the fact that these loot boxes are in these games at all, making it so that half the time these parents have absolutely no idea that these loot boxes are in their children's games, which is partly the point. Going back to Brazil's Justice Department, in terms of loot boxes, they do in fact mention certain companies by name, such as Activision, Electronic Arts, or EA, Riot Games, Gonorrhea, I don't know who that is. I've never heard of that company before. Nintendo, Konami, Valve, Ubisoft, Tencent, Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Sony. And in terms of penalty, if loot boxes do in fact get banned in Brazil and these companies continue to not listen and go forward with continuing to put loot boxes in their games, it says here that every single day these companies will be paying a $4 million fine. That is Brazilian money, though, which it equates to roughly $693,000 US dollars, again, every single day. Yes, these companies have a ridiculous amount of wealth, but in terms of paying this fine every single day, yeah, I'm pretty sure it'll incentivize them to stop, is what I wanted to say. But according to this here, loot boxes are expected to generate $20 billion worldwide by 2025. That is a lot of money, and I don't know how much, of that each company is making individually, but I'm hoping this isn't a scenario in which an individual company just ignores the fines because they're making so much revenue in loot boxes that it just makes more sense to just pay the fine and continue what they're doing. But again, this is a fine that's every single day, so I imagine it'll have somewhat of an impact. The use of loot boxes by game developers has caused controversy in many other countries around the globe, including the US, Germany, and the UK, and is currently considered illegal in Belgium and the Netherlands. Over in the UK, it says here that the House of Lords Gambling Committee says video game loot boxes should be regulated under gambling laws. And what that tells tells me is that they may not be trying to ban loot boxes in its entirety, but they are trying to regulate loot boxes under, again, current gambling laws, making it so that loot boxes are treated the same as any other form of gambling. The House of Lords committee also goes on to say if a product looks like gambling and feels like gambling, it should be regulated as gambling, which, yeah, that makes absolutely perfect sense. And I'm not understanding why there's this huge controversy over loot boxes to begin with. It's obviously gambling, and not to mention the fact that many gamers don't want it. They do not want loot boxes in their games at all. Me included, I do not want them. I think they should be banned out entirely. It's stupid. It also goes on to say that the government must act immediately to bring loot boxes within the remit of gambling legislation and regulation. One thing I almost forgot to mention is the fact that, yes, it's the general consensus amongst gamers that we do not want loot boxes in our games. Part of the way gaming companies have been combating that information is by simply saying, well, you know, you've been paying for it. Look here, look at these stats. There is a large amount of you that, you know, absolutely love loot boxes or surprise mechanics, which that is the dumbest term I've ever heard. But this goes on to explain that gaming companies are only really focusing on those who disproportionately contribute to loot box revenue, which is high-risk individuals, like people who are already addicted to gambling, people who have become addicted to gambling, individuals who are financially well off and they don't really need to focus on how much they're spending, so they can just dump as much money as they want into loot boxes and they don't care, or children who don't really have an understanding of the concept of money to begin with. So multiple countries are determining what the future of loot boxes will look like in their respected countries based off the University of Plymouth and the University of Wolverhampton's studies. And when going through their 50-page study, 54 pages, the tail end of it, I think is critical information that I do want to read, and just bear with me, we will discuss at the end of it. When taking this longer-term perspective, the potential short-sightedness of a loot box as gambling regulation is revealed. Such a move wouldn't just create a series of complex new challenges for governments, legislators, lawyers, and gambling commissions, but furthermore, as the DCMS has already pointed out, game companies would be unlikely to even bother with the reams of paperwork, operating licenses, and subsequent regulations around transparency, duty of care, and age restrictions. After all the legislative heavy lifting, loot boxes would soon be consigned to a niche monetization strategy. This all begs the question, would an outright loot box ban be simpler for all concerned developers, gamers, governments, taxpayers alike? This approach would have advantages and would likely be popular, applauded by many gamers whose attitudes toward them are predominantly negative. Moreover, such a straightforward move would free up limited government and regulatory resources for more pressing tasks. I was super happy to see that, because that is an argument against regulation and for an outright ban. Not only do I want an outright ban, not only do I want to see loot boxes just gone in its entirety. One of the fears that I had, at least in the US anyway, is once you allow the US government specifically to begin regulating games, we're going to run into a lot more problems in terms of game regulations. It will not just stop at loot boxes. And do I really need to explain that? Every single time there's a mass shooting or some form of crazy event that takes place, instead of actually addressing the issue in the United States, our government officials will come out and say, oh, Gaming is terrible. It's influencing people to do horrible things, when all evidence points to the contrary.
I care.
All evidence shows that that is not true. But even outside of that argument, over here in the US with our government, every single time you give them a foot, they take 1.5 miles or more, or it's a bad idea to give them the ability to regulate our game. It's unfortunate that in the gaming industry, it was regulating itself for so long and everything was fine. It was doing so well, but developers and gaming companies got greedy. Not even the developers, really. The gaming companies, the higher ups, they got greedy. And I'm glad these universities made these arguments, because we do not want regulation over gaming at all. We just want regulation over the loot boxes inside of gaming. We just want the loot boxes banned and then forget about us. Leave us to our business. And then if we have another problem, we will come to you. Also, again, just in those 2 paragraphs, another very important takeaway from that is the fact that they accurately point out the fact that if the government decides to regulate loot boxes instead of outright banning loot boxes, these gaming companies are not going to do the work in terms of making themselves more transparent and all the, you know, paperwork and all of the things that are going to be involved in order to accurately abide by the regulations. Instead, they're just going to find loopholes and continue to do loot boxes, just in a different way. And lastly, it accurately sells the idea to the government officials that not only is it less work, but also it's going to make a very large group of individuals happy. Your approval ratings, am I right? So I want to say that because these gaming companies are making so much money off of these loot boxes, that they're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure loot boxes never get regulated and they never go away. As long as these gaming companies continue to present arguments like this.
First, we don't call them loot boxes. I think that was
whatever term you wish to apply to them. Do you consider them ethical?
So what we look at as surprise mechanics.
Then we gonna be all right. Let me know how you guys feel about all this in the comments section. I love you all. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.